Howdy, fellow composers, and welcome to our fourth lesson on writing melodies. Today we're going to be talking about harmonic setting, which is setting a harmony against the melodies that we started writing last week. So, taking a look at one of the first melodies that we wrote last week, which is this guy here, there's the whole 8-bar period of that melody. How did we get from there? And actually, I'll just play it for you really quick. Hear it? Very nice and pretty, and it's clearly changed up here. We've moved up an octave, and we have all this business happening down in the piano part. So how did we get all that business happening in the piano part? How did we get to there? Well, we're not going to talk about this bottom left-hand stuff today. That's a little bit more advanced, but we've got all these chords, and really I developed this left-hand piano stuff, this bass left stuff, based off of these triads and chords that I chose. So in order to start setting a chord against the melody, we have to remember some of our melody writing rules. The first measure starts on the tonic every single time. It gives us that feeling of home. The first phrase ends at measure 4, and it ends on the dominant. It gives us a feeling of kind of suspension, like the melody is about to go on. Measure 5 can start anywhere. I chose the tonic because I thought it was a nice, well, it is. It's a nice, safe spot. You're never going to go wrong. It might not be the most interesting, but it totally works. And the last bar of the whole 8-measure period also ends on the tonic because we're going home. So what else do we need to know? Let's go to the next slide. This is once again the full melody here, and I just slotted this in for those people who are working at home. So we talked about triads last week, and the easiest way to start setting chords for your harmony is to find a triad that has the same notes as your melody, particularly, and I should say specifically, at beat 1 of each measure. I would say normally you don't worry about doing just triads. Triads are a little bit boring. They don't have proper voice leading, blah, blah, blah. But we're going to just start with triads because they're the simplest chords to build. So I've taken the first measure of our melody and set 3 different chords against that. Let's pop over to Sibelius here. So here's that example. I've got 3 different chords. There's the first note of my measure, and here's a triad that starts on that note. Here again, repeating, but the C is not in there at the bottom. It is right here, though. So this is still a triad that has a C in it, so it should work. And here's one more time, and the C is also here, but we end up with a different chord. Right, so we've got an A minor chord there. Oops. We've got an F chord there, and we've got a C chord there. So let's listen to each of these individually. I just have to get my cursor over here. Oh, too far. So that's the original melody. That's the one that I used before. It kind of works, but this E, because it's in such a strong position and it doesn't exist in this triad here, doesn't quite sound right. That one sounds kind of cool. Not a great starting place. It doesn't feel like starting from home when you start there, but it definitely fits into the chord. Let's hear them one after the other so that you can see how they compare. That sounds like we've got kind of a chord progression going. Here, I'm gonna jack this melody up just an octave. Perfect octave. So that's a little bit more audible. Let's see what it's like versus it's a little bit closer to what we had heard with the completed melody before. Hey, where's my piano part? Kind of sounds like we actually have a chord progression going there, which is sort of cool. But anyways, we've listened to all three of these. Now, of course, because this is measure one, we really need to pick this chord here. But if this was not measure one, we could really go with any of these triads. So as I mentioned, each triad contains the C that's at the very beginning. So they all kind of work, but not for measure one. So honestly, depends on the chord progression. We are doing a specific chord progression, which I haven't sort of illustrated for you yet, but we're following a pattern that's typical of classical, sort of early classical, maybe late Baroque. So remember how I said last week that the tonic feels like home? Well, we need to reinforce that feeling of home by adding the tonic triad right below it. We can also call this the one chord using those Roman numerals, and I'm just putting a 1 in brackets next to them just to remind you that that's Roman numeral 1. And we call it the tonic triad because the tonic is the root of the triad. So the root is the lowest note in the triad. So I'm calling that a tonic triad, which makes sense. Build a triad on the tonic, call it the tonic triad. Really easy sort of way to remember what they're called and why they're called. Now we need to look at the end of the phrase, or the phrase cadence. The phrase cadence from last week's melody ended on the dominant, on the 5th note. So it makes sense to then build a dominant triad below it because, well, that's what we want. I mean, we could build a tonic triad because it's got the same notes in it, but it would feel like we're going home prematurely. So we've got two measures. We've got one with our tonic triad, and we've got one with our dominant triad. And I think I have that set up in Sibelius as well. Yeah, here we go. So I'll just fast forward. So you can hear how that feeling of suspension there. And I guess once again, I'll pop this up. Octave. Back that up so you can hear it again. Fantastic. We're on a roll. Now you'll notice that I added the root of the triad in here. This is a G and this is a G. I'm just doing it because it sounds a little bit better. We will be doing that in the future. I'm not going to ask you necessarily to do that for an assignment just yet, but it really is only one extra step. Take the root of the triad and put it in the bass. It just gives it a more round, full feeling. Now, the melody has a cadence too, the ending of the melody. Obviously, we have to have a cadence. The second phrase in our melody has to have an ending that makes sense. So melodic cadences are a little bit more complicated. The second phrase is going to end on the tonic note, so the harmony definitely has to end on the tonic triad. So once again, here is the second half of our melody, the second phrase in our 8-bar period. So I'm going to hop over to our example on Sibelius. And I'll pop this up an octave right off the bat. So let's hear what that sounds like. Good, so we have that reinforced feeling of going home. So here's our full melody now, and I think, did I write it out? Yes, I did. So let's kind of hear that sketch out of the triads and see what it gives to us. Good, and I'm not going to worry about transposing that for now. So you can hear that there's now a bit of a sketch of a chord progression happening. And I've just pointed out here, we've got our tonic triad, our dominant triad, and our tonic triad, and I've just reinforced in the bass here. So let's do a quick review before we go on. The tonic first scale degree. So the tonic triad, it's built on the tonic. That means that the tonic is the root. The root is the lowest note in a chord or triad. So the root might not always be the basis of the chord, but it's always the lowest note. The dominant is the fifth scale degree. We know that. We've talked about that lots. So therefore, the dominant triad is a triad built on the fifth scale degree. The dominant is the root. So what do we do with the other first beats of the measures? For the purpose of this lecture, we're just going to sort of choose whatever triads fit with the first note on the beginning of each measure. Pardon me. So I've got some that I'll show you in a second, and I pretty much just chose them because I think that they sound nice. I've also made sure to avoid using the tonic triad too often, especially in such a short melody. It's going to sound stilted, like we're kind of jumping around. It's not going to make it very clear where the phrase begins and ends. And I try to use a triad which matches as many melody notes in that particular measure. So let's flip back to Sibelius here. Okay, so here we go. We had this measure done before, we had this measure done before, and we had this measure done before, but I've chosen here. So there's a G and a B in this bar. Well, the G triad makes sense to put there because those two notes are already in it. Same thing here. There's a C and an A. So I could put an A chord there. I could also put an F chord in there, and I think that's what I did in the original setting of this melody, but I thought, I kind of like this A minor sound. So let's just stop talking about it for a second and actually give it a listen, and I will transpose this time. Okay, so I chose an A minor chord here and an A minor chord here, or triad, I should say, when in my original setting, I think I chose maybe an F, or at least here, I know I chose an F chord. So either of those would have worked, obviously, because we've done two different versions of them. So here I've entered in the chord numbers, the tonic, dominant, the sixth, again the dominant, the fourth, the sixth, the four, and the tonic one more time. So I've just sort of notated these so you can kind of see which chords I've chosen. I've numbered these, oh yeah, in both the Roman numerals and the numbers, just to make it a little bit clearer for those of you who are having trouble remembering the Roman numerals. Now, you'll notice that some of these are in uppercase Roman numerals and some of these are lowercase. Really, that just depicts major and minor. I don't expect you to know that right now. So if you want to just use a bracketed number to tell me which chord it is for this time being, that's totally fine. I'm just giving you some options for notation, and so that when we do change to something permanently, you'll be familiar with it. So we have to look at cadential motion now. Last week we talked, or maybe it was last... Yeah, it was last week. We talked about how scale degrees move. If the last note is 1, we want to move to it from a 2. We can go 7 to 8, and we can go to 5 to 1 or 5 to 8. It is really important that this motion happens if the 5 is the lowest note. If the 5 appears somewhere else, it can do something different. But if the dominant note, particularly since it'll be the root of the triad, is at the bottom, it's got to go 5-1. It gives us a very clear going home motion. So this desire for notes to move in a specific direction is called voice leading. Voice leading is this, I guess, what we'd call like a normative thing in Western music that has developed over centuries. Our ears are very accustomed to it, so we're going to stick to it for now. You can break these rules later, of course. 5 moving to 5 is absolutely fine in voice leading as long as it is not the lowest note. So you'll notice here that I've got a 5-1 in the melody. That's great, works fine. But I've got a 4 moving to 1 and a 4 moving to 1 here. I don't have any 7-8 motion, any 2-1 motion. So this doesn't work for our voice leading rules at all. We need to add another chord in between there. So So let's pop back into Sibelius here. So here, I'm going to actually, I'll just delete this really quick and go back to our... Good, okay. So here we have our final measure, and we need to get that voice leading action happening. So again, our 5-1 up here is working fine, but our 4-1, we need to do something about this. So all I'm going to do, I'm just going to add a G in there, and that gives us that 5-1 motion, or 5-8 motion, I guess, in this case, because it's going up. But what about here? We have a 1. How do we want to get to 1? Well, we could come in from a 7, or we could come in from a 2. I think I'll go with the 2. And then we have our 3. We can get there kind of in a couple different ways, so I'm not going to worry about it. We've got a 5 here, so let's add our G in, and we'll do a 5-5. That's perfectly acceptable. Now this chord only has 2 notes in it, so I want to add 1 more note in it. So let's add a B in. Now this B looks like it's going down to the G. That's not going to work. So let's just add 1 more C in there so we get this, which is a really typical ending. This is not a triad, but that's okay. Let's listen to these last couple of measures here. And once again, I'll transpose up. Oops. That chord motion that you just heard there is super typical. 4-5-1. Really, really common classical ending to any kind of piece of music, to go this 4-5-1 chord. So here is, now we have our complete harmonic setting. I've set bass notes from each of the chords in between, and we have our 4-5-1. This is not the same chord progression that I used in our original melody setting that you got to see there, but it works just all the same. So there are different ways to set a melody against chords depending on what you really like the sound of. And here I've just, indicated that we have our 4 chord, we've built a 5 chord, and now we're going to the 1 chord. So here's our 5-1 bass, 2-1, 7-8, and 5-5. All of our voice leading rules work just fine. We've literally hit all the buttons that we need to do. Now, as I mentioned, this is not a triad. That's okay. I was more interested in getting the proper voice leading. I don't care. Next week we'll be talking about the fact that you can invert chords, because this is just a G chord. It would be G, B, D going up if we wanted it as a triad. For now, no concern over the fact that it doesn't line up as a triad. This is this last triad of the song. I don't care if it's a triad or an inverted chord or whatever, as long as you've got the right voice leading. That's the main important part. So let's do a quick review. We take the first note in each bar, and we pick the first note in each bar, and we make sure that the triad contains that note. In measure 1, we need a tonic triad. Measure 4, we need a dominant triad. And in measure 8, we need a tonic triad. So those ones are kind of set in stone for us. And in the last measure, we follow the voice leading rules. So our voice leading rules are, if you don't have a dominant triad on beat 1 of the last measure, add 1. In our case, we added it on beat 2 because we had a 2-4 bar. You could add it on beat 3 of a 4-4 bar. That will make a very clear sense of going home. And these are our voice leading rules here. So you can really set up that final chordal motion before you fill in all of the other triads. It's up to you. For this week's assignment, you are going to harmonize a melody with chords. I'm going to choose a melody for you so that it's fairly simple. It'll just be in 2/4, so it'll be kind of short. So you don't have to worry about anything super complex, or if you composed a really complex melody last week, you're going to very likely struggle quite a bit with adding harmony to it. So we're not going to worry about that. Everyone will do the same melody. If you can play it, I strongly recommend that you give that a shot because you'll really be able to hear how it goes. And lastly, and this is a shout out to Gavin Brasky who tried this last week. There's a website called flat.io, and it is a music writing site. And I'm just going to hop in there right now. You don't have to look at it if you don't want to. You can end off right here. But really quickly, this is flat.io. You can sign up for free. It allows you to write 15 pieces of music. And when I start a new song, I'll call it temp, and I'm gonna just pick let's pick tuba. Yes, tuba, and let's grab a piano, just a grand piano. Yes. Okay, create. Et voila, we have a bar of music, and I believe it automatically extends for you, so you can start putting in your notes. You just kind of drag and drop. This is purely optional, but if you want to hear what you're writing, this is a great tool. Personally, I love using Sibelius because of this. This is much simpler than Sibelius. It's kind of fun to play around with, so I absolutely encourage you to give it a try. And you can export your documents as PDFs, so you don't have to handwrite your music, which is so much faster. So please, absolutely give this a try if you feel like you want to, but do not feel like it's absolutely necessary. That's it for today, composing fans. I look forward to next week when we'll continue on with these exercises. We'll slow down a little bit to give you some time to digest what we've been doing here. But we're moving very quickly towards being able to compose songs, which is just incredibly exciting. So have a great rest of your week whenever you're reading this or listening to this. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.